Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here with us today. So what I'm going to talk about today is a paper that is based on the third course that was done as a part of this large research project that Josh and Todd have described. So this was a year-long course that took place last year with 16 master's students at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. And the goal of our course was to evaluate the causes of variation in African countries' capacities to reduce the risk of, prepare for, and respond to natural disasters in the context of climate change. So I won't talk about climate change that much today, but the project was done as a part of this broader initiative on climate change under the expectation that climate change will change the natural hazards and shocks that are faced by countries in Africa, and we wanted to understand the capacity of those countries both to deal with the hazards that they already face and the ones that they will face moving into the future. So the existing academic research on this topic is actually quite rich. There's a rich literature in general on the incentives for governments to invest in reform or to invest in development. And there's also a reasonably large literature on the incentives of governments to invest in preparedness for dealing with natural shocks. So we have a large number of theoretical explanations for why we might see variation in policy outcomes. The problem that we perceived in this literature is that there's actually very little empirical testing of these theoretical perspectives. And then of the empirical testing that has been done, there are a reasonable number of issues. So the first issue is that the research that exists in an econometric sense or broad large N sense is largely based on what we consider questionable quantitative data. It's very difficult to measure the effects of a natural hazard or the size of a disaster. It's very difficult to deal with changes in reporting of natural disasters and hazards both over time and across regions. So there are a lot of reasons to be concerned that the actual data we have to measure the size of shocks is not even good enough to serve as an independent or dependent variable. On the other hand, the research that's been done from a qualitative perspective typically only focuses on one case. So we may have a very nice understanding of the issues dealt with by a particular country, but we don't have a lot of leverage to generalize from that particular case study. And in addition to both of these issues, neither the quantitative nor the qualitative work tends to address multiple hypotheses to rather provide a more comprehensive understanding of the strength of any one of these hypotheses relative to each other. So for all of these reasons, we perceive there to be very limited comprehensive evaluation empirically of the existing theoretical literature. So based on that, we developed a research approach that is highlighted in this figure. And within the broad context of all of the things that one might study related to natural disaster preparedness, we attempted to focus on the areas that you see here in white within the context of other very related areas sort of in the neighborhood of issues, which are highlighted in gray. So we look at hypotheses related to the expectations and past experiences dealing with natural hazards, expectations about the provision of external aid or other forms of aid for dealing with natural hazards, and general political and economic conditions, and I'll describe all of those in more detail from the perspective of hypotheses. And then we look at how those factors potentially affect political will and investment in preparedness for natural disasters. So when I talk about investment here, I mean this quite broadly. We're not just talking about financial investment in preparedness for natural disasters. We're also talking about investment of bureaucratic capital, which is sometimes all that is available in an African country, political capital, the support in general for these kinds of issues. And then we evaluate the effect of that political will and investment on eventual national institutional capacities to deal with natural disasters. And I'll describe how we measure or operationalize institutional capacity in one moment. Now, the research design that we use to evaluate these issues and responding to what we saw already in the literature was to adopt what I'll call here a medium N approach, and one that relies primarily on qualitative analysis. Now, the qualitative research was, as I described, conducted by students at the LBJ School in the last year. They conducted both secondary research and primary field work in all of the countries that I'll tell you about that are included in this study. And in doing so, evaluated a wide range of hypotheses that I'll highlight. So these are the case studies that are included in this study. We organized the teams as paired country teams because we could just pick a set of cases across the continent to evaluate. We wanted to at least give ourselves a little bit more leverage to evaluate the response of countries dealing with similar types of natural hazards. So we picked countries at least in geographical proximity to each other that we could compare to each other in addition to the broad comparison across all of the countries. So as you can see here, the countries that are included are Senegal and the Gambia, Ghana and Togo, Ethiopia and Kenya, Zambia and Zimbabwe, and Malawi and Mozambique. All countries, many of which we've heard a lot about already in the last 2 days, so I'll just contribute a little bit more to that discussion. So how did we actually try to understand what the policy outcomes were? What is the national institutional capacity of a given country to respond to natural hazards? Well, in order to develop that measure of our effectively dependent variable, we resorted to reliance on the Hyogo framework, which is the UN framework on preparedness and response to natural disasters, really disaster risk reduction. And in the Hyogo framework, of which I'm sure many of you are familiar, there are 5 priorities for action that the signatories to the Hyogo framework have agreed to pursue during the period from 2005 to 2015. So across those 5 priorities, all of which have subpoints, which I haven't attempted to list here, the students conducted research on each of the countries and developed a qualitative profile that's a part of the broader report that is coming out of this initiative, describing the capacity of each of those countries in responding to each of those priorities. They then, in a coordinated fashion, developed relative scores from 1 to 5 for each of the countries on each of these priorities, and that's what you see here. So these are the only really quantitative or the only numbers you'll see in the approach, and they're based on this qualitative analysis of each country's outcomes. Now, the hypotheses that we evaluate as a part of trying to understand what got countries to those capacity outcomes are summarized here very briefly. Each of these hypotheses actually has many sub-hypotheses under it that are evaluated within the broad report, but we would be here for many more days if I tried to discuss those all with you. So I'm just going to highlight the general hypotheses here. The first one is about perceived risk. So this is simply that countries who have had more experience with natural hazards in the past, or who expect to have more experience with natural hazards in the future, will be more likely to invest in preparedness for dealing with those hazards. The second hypothesis has to do with economic strength. And this is the idea that those countries that have more economic resources, all else equal, will be more likely to invest in preparedness. The third hypothesis or set of hypotheses has to do with electoral incentives and democracy. So focusing largely on democratic states in Africa, the idea here is that in those cases where governments perceive that there will be an electoral benefit from investing in preparedness, they will be more likely to make those investments. On the other hand, our political development hypothesis is much more generally applicable to both democracies and autocracies. And the argument here is that in those cases where you have politicians of a higher quality and bureaucrats of a higher quality who are also, in many cases, insulated from political manipulations, you should see more investment in preparedness for natural hazards as well. And then finally, we have a moral hazard hypothesis, which is derived from the insurance literature, and argues that in those cases where countries expect that they will receive significant foreign aid or external aid of any type in the emergence of a natural disaster, they will be less likely to invest in preparedness for that natural disaster. So they'll be more likely to just wait and anticipate the aid coming when the natural hazard arrives. So these are the hypotheses that the team evaluated in general in the context of the case studies. And these are the overall findings from the project. So you see here in the green boxes with plus signs, those are the areas for which we found reasonable evidence to support that hypothesis in one form or another in the country. Those in red and with minus signs, unsurprisingly, are those cases where we found evidence against the hypothesis. And the one case where you see a yellow question mark, there was really mixed support and we couldn't come to a final conclusion on the hypothesis in that case. So now what I want to do is tell you in a little bit more descriptive form what we believe the underlying mechanisms are effectively that produce this kind of outcome. Because you can see here that in general we found support for a large number of the hypotheses, but in no case was that absolute. There are always exceptions to the rule, and those exceptions can be very telling when we try to understand why they're exceptions. And then in one case, in the case of moral hazard, we actually found, happily, sufficient evidence against that hypothesis, but we really want to understand why that's the case. So I'll start with perceived risk and economics, because I think these are the two most intuitive hypotheses of the bunch, right? So these are cases where it sort of makes sense on its face that we should see these kind of outcomes. And we did find reasonable support for both of these hypotheses on the ground, but as I said, not always. So the countries with the greatest perceived risk, think here of places like Ethiopia and Mozambique that have faced considerable natural hazards, either in the form of floods or droughts in the past, are the most likely to invest in some way in disaster risk management, be that with political capital, with financial capital, whatever. And this happens even if they're poor, right? Mozambique and Ethiopia are not the richest countries in our set of case studies, okay? But they are investing considerable amounts in disaster risk management. So that's a good thing in a sense. But the other findings for economic resources, while we found evidence for the hypothesis, it's really hypothesis in the negative. And by that I mean what we see is a lot of very poor countries that don't have a lot of financial resources to invest in disaster risk management, in preparedness. So in those cases where there is strong perceived risk, we do see activity. But in general, the financial weakness across the board makes it difficult for most states, all else equal, to make these investments. And then surprisingly, in some cases, we actually see some of the richest countries in the case study group not investing as much as we would expect. And here I'm talking about Kenya and Senegal. So in these cases, we have the greatest GDP per capita among the set of case studies, and yet we don't see a coordinated effort to really develop a strong and consistent disaster risk management plan. So we need other hypotheses to help explain why this is the case. And democracy and political development helps to get us a little bit of the way there. So here again, we find that politics matters, and electoral politics matters in democracies, but unfortunately it's not in the way that we would like to support preparedness. And this goes with the gist of the literature as it exists, in that in those countries where politicians see an electoral incentive to deal with natural disasters, it's in the investment in response, not in preparedness. And this is because, as many people have identified, it's difficult to observe investments in preparedness. You don't see as well the benefits when the disaster has not hit of investing in a levee or of investing in some other kind of regulation that improves the ability of buildings to resist natural hazards. But you do see the effects on the end in response. So politicians have an incentive to respond when a disaster hits, but not to prepare for it in advance. Now, on the other hand, political development seems to matter even in autocracies. So where we have a reasonably capable bureaucracy, or as in the case of the Gambia, a bureaucracy that is insulated by a political leader, by the vice president in this case, we see good investments in DRM despite the fact that you don't have an electoral incentive at all in the Gambia to invest in preparedness or response, as the case is. And this also helps us, political development also helps us to explain what are some otherwise puzzling cases, like I would argue Kenya, a place where we don't have as substantial bureaucratic capacity to invest. And so as a result, we see much of the emphasis on disaster risk management being put off onto the private sector, onto the non-governmental organizations very active in Kenya, without any true management from the central government's part. And then in terms of moral hazard, the one case where I said we actually have significant evidence against the hypothesis as it exists in the literature, this is an argument that in theory seems quite reasonable, but we found very little evidence of it in practice. And I think it's important to understand why we didn't find that and how that relates to the role of international organizations in disaster risk management. Because what we saw was an active focus on the part of IOs, on the part of other international non-governmental organizations on preparedness. And by focusing on preparedness, these actors then limited their future risk of dealing with an extreme natural hazard by improving the capacity on the ground through their active interests. So they basically reduced the chances of moral hazard by forcing the government to work with them on preparedness. Okay? Now, this is an optimistic and good outcome, but there's also a risk here because international actors have almost as much difficulty raising funds for preparedness activities as do national governments. Okay? People don't respond as well to efforts to give donations to CARE or similar organizations that are focused on preparedness because they want to help people in need who they see are in need. So international organizations are doing what they can to invest in preparedness, but we need to be aware that if this doesn't continue into the future, the risk of moral hazard may reassert itself on the ground. So just to conclude, I think what we've done here as a part of this project is provide what at least we see as the first comprehensive qualitative assessment of African national governments' capacities to both prepare for and respond to natural disasters. And while it's good that we found evidence to support a number of the hypotheses that exist in the literature, it's also perhaps, to me, more compelling that we've been able to see how these hypotheses interact on the ground and help us to explain some cases where it's not at least clear from the start why a government is investing or not investing in a particular manner. And then finally, I just want to highlight, particularly for this audience, the moral hazard finding, because it does bring attention to the important role of international and non-governmental organizations in developing preparedness capacity on the ground, and this is something that I think we need to continue to support moving forward. Thank you.